Hello everyone! Welcome back to Xcoding with Alvian. This is the second part of the WidgetKit tutorial series, where we will extend the COVID-19 stats widget to support intent configuration that accepts custom country parameter. Instead of only showing a global stats, we can show stats from different countries in the home screen. Along the way, we will implement several tasks based on this checklist. First, declare custom intent and add support for widget in IntentDefinition file. Second, create custom parameter for the intent. Third, create intent extension to provide handler for retrieving dynamic values for parameter. Fourth, implement IntentTimelineProvider protocol to provide timeline entries and snapshot based on the value of the intent parameter. Last, set up widget to use intent configuration with custom intent and IntentTimelineProvider. If you haven't watched the first part of the tutorial, please watch it first so you can get more context about the concept and implementation of timeline entry and TimelineProvider. We also built the widget UI that supports all the system family sizes. I have put the link to the first part of the video at the description below. Before we begin, let me show you the final results of the Intent Configurable Widget that we will build. Let's add the widget from the widget selection screen. Here's the magic. Tap to long press on the widget. It should show the context menu action to edit the widget. From here, we can search or tap the country that we want to set as the parameter for the widget. Let me select Indonesia. In the home screen, the widget should reload with the new data. The widget now shows the country flag as well as the total case stats for Indonesia. Let's add the second widget with another country as the parameter. Let's select India. Okay, now we have two widgets with different parameters. First one is Indonesia and the second one is India. That's it for the demo of the Intent Configurable Widget. Now, let's dive into Xcode and start implementing. To begin, please download the starter project from the GitHub repository link I provided in the description. Open the Part 2 starter directory, and then click on the Xcode proj file. Make sure you have installed the latest Xcode 12 release. In this tutorial, I used Xcode 12 Beta 4. First, we need to create an IntentDefinition file and create the custom intent for our widget. If you have implemented Siri shortcut before, this should be pretty familiar. From the menu bar, click on File, then New, then File. Search for the IntentDefinition file. Click on Next. Name it as COVID-19 stats. It should create a new file inside the project. Click on the file to open the IntentDefinition editor. Click on the plus button at the bottom, then select New Intent. Rename the intent as Select Country. Set the category as View. There are many other categories that you can choose, such as Order, Share, Search. Those categories are useful if you are creating a Siri shortcut task associated with a particular category. Fill the title and description as Select Country. Check the intent is eligible for widgets checkbox. We won't check the other checkboxes, but if you want this intent to also support Siri shortcuts, then you can also check the configurable in Siri shortcuts checkbox, as well as the intent is eligible for Siri suggestion. That's it for the first checklist item. Let's mark it as complete. Next, we'll create the custom parameter for the intent. Go back to the IntentDefinition file, click on plus button, and then click on the new type. Rename this as country param. Fill the display name as country param. As this parameter represents a country, let's add additional ISO property with type of string. This is a 2-digit ISO letter returned by the COVID-19 API.com when we fetch all the countries affected endpoint. Go back to select country intent, then click on the plus button from the parameter section. Name this as country. Then select the type as the country param. Make sure the configurable checkbox is selected to enable the editing in the widget. As we will provide the value dynamically from the COVID-19 API.com, check the dynamic options checkbox and uncheck this resolvable checkbox. That's it for the second checklist item. We have created the custom intent and the custom parameter type. Let's mark this as complete. Let's move on to the third items. Create intent extension to provide handler for retrieving dynamic values for the parameter. Okay. To provide the options dynamically to the parameter, we need to create an intent extension target. From the menu bar, click on File, New, and Target. Type intent extension, and then click Next. Name it as COVID-19 stats intent extension. Click on Finish. This should also activate the scheme. Okay, now make sure the COVID-19 stats IntentDefinition is selected and then open the Identity and Type panel and make sure to check the COVID-19 stats intent extension inside the target membership. This will enable the access for the select country intent and country param generated files to all the targets. From the project navigator, highlight the COVID-19 API, model, and utils inside the shared folder. Then, from the identity inspector, check the COVID-19 stats intent extension. Let's open the utils.swift file. At the bottom, declare an extension for the country param. First, create a convenience initializer that accepts the country struct. Inside, call the designated initializer, passing identifier with the country.id and display with country.name. At last, set the ISO property using the country ISO. Then, declare a static property name global with the type of country param. In the implementation, we can just initialize the country param and return it using the country initializer. In this case, we can just pass the ID and name using the hard-coded string with global. And for the ISO, we pass a named string. This will be used to represent the global case for the country parameter. Next, open the intent handler.swift file inside the COVID-19 stats intent extension target. Implement the select country handling protocol in the intent handler class. There's one required method we need to implement. Provide country options collection for the intent. It has a completion closure that accepts IN object collection of country param. In the implementation, we just need to use the COVID-19 API service singleton and invoke getAllCountries method to retrieve all the affected countries from the COVID-19 API.com. In the completion closure, the API service passes the result type containing the array of countries struct. Let's use the switch statement on the result. In the case of success, we retrieve the country's associated value. Let's map this to the country params array using the map operator, passing the country to the initializer and the closure. At last, we can just invoke the completion passing the IN object collection. When we initialize the IN object collection, we will use different sections. The first section will contain a global country param, and for another section, it will contain the array of all the countries. Make sure to pass nil for the error. Here is the results when using a different sections. As you can see, we have a single section containing the global selection and another section containing all the countries that we can select. In the case of failure, invoke the completion passing in an object collection with a single country param items. We'll just pass the country param global static property. That's it for providing dynamic values to the parameter inside the intent handler target extension. Let's check this as complete in the checklist. Now let's move on to implement the fourth checklist item, which is implement IntentTimelineProvider protocol to provide timeline entries and snapshot based on the value of the intent parameter. Inside the COVID-19 stats widget folder, create a new Swift file named total stats intent timeline provider.swift. Make sure only the COVID-19 stats widget extension checkbox is selected. Import WidgetKit and declare the total stats intent timeline provider struct. Make it implement the intent timeline provider protocol. The intent timeline provider protocol is a bit different compared to the standard timeline provider, as the methods inside the intent timeline provider provide an additional parameter, which is the intent containing the parameter that we have created. Okay, now let's declare the type alias for the entry. We are going to use the total case entry. For the intent, we are going to use the select country intent. Also declare the service property and assign it with the default value of COVID-19 API service singleton. Let's declare the first method, placeholder in context. It returns a single total case entry instance. In this case, we can just return the total case entry placeholder stub. Next, declare a private helper method named fetchTotalCaseStats that accepts a country param parameter as well as completion closure with the result type of total case entry. We'll use this later in the snapshot and provide timeline entries methods to fetch the total case entry data given a country parameter. In the body implementation, first, we retrieve the optional identifier from the param using the guard statement. If it doesn't exist, we just invoke the completion passing failure with the COVID-19 API error no data. To continue, we are going to use the switch statement on the ID. The first case is if the value match the country param global identifier. In this case, we should fetch the global total case stats using the services get global total count method. We can just use the switch passing the result. For the failure case, we can just invoke the completion passing failure with the error. In the success case, we retrieve the get stats entry associated value, and then we initialize the total case entry struct. For the date, we can pass the current date. For the total count title, we can use the globe emoji, and we can retrieve the confirmed death and recover from the stats. At last, we can invoke the completion, passing success, and the total cache entry. Let's make this using the string literal. For the default case, we can invoke the services getTotalCount method, passing the country identifier. Inside the completion closure, we can just use result in the switch statement. For the failure case, we can just invoke the completion, passing failure, and the error. For the success case, we can just initialize the total cache entry. For the date, we can pass the current date, and for the total count title, we can use the iso.flag property to display the flag associated with the ISO code. This flag is a custom computed property located in users.swift. It maps a 2-digit ISO country code to the emoji flag. At last, invoke the completion, passing success with the total cache entry. That's it for the fetch total cache stats method. Now, let's move on and implement the get snapshot for configuration with context method. In the implementation, first we check if context.isPreview is true. If it is true, we can just invoke the completion, passing a placeholder total cache entry. Inside the else statement, we can invoke the fetch total cache stats method. For the param, we can retrieve it from the configuration parameter country property. And as this is default, we also need to provide a default value. In this case, I just provide a global stats. In the completion closure, we can just use the switch statement on the results. In the success case, we just invoke the completion, passing the entry. In the case of failure, we can just invoke the completion, passing a placeholder total cache entry. That's it for the get snapshot method. Now let's implement the get timeline configuration with context. In the body implementation, we just need to invoke the fetch total cache stats. We can retrieve the country param as a we can retrieve the country param from the configuration country property, and we also provide a default value which is global in case it is nil. In the completion closure, we just use the switch on the result. In the success case, we initialize the timeline, passing a single entry to the entries array. For the policy, we'll set it to reload after 10 minutes using the after refresh policy. We can just use 60 seconds multiplied by 10. Make sure to invoke the completion, passing the timeline. For the failure case, we just initialize the timeline, passing a stop placeholder entry and set the refresh policy to 2 minutes from the current date. That's it for the IntentTimelineProvider implementation. Let's mark it as done in the checklist. Now, for the final part, it is set up widget to use intent configuration with a custom intent and IntentTimelineProvider. This will be pretty simple and quick. Go to the COVID-19 stats widget.swift file. Let's remove the static configuration in here. Then we just need to declare the intent configuration. Let's pass the kind from the constant. And for the intent, we are going to use the select country intent.self. For the provider, we can use the total stats intent timeline provider. And for the content closure, we can just use the stats widget entry view, passing the entry. Let's also change the description by removing the global. That's it for the intent configuration setup. The widget should now be editable with the select country intent parameter inside the home screen. Okay, so let's try to build and run the app. Select the iPhone as the target scheme here and build and run. Looks like there's an error here. The COVID-19 stats intent extension doesn't define an intent supported key with the array value in the info list. Okay, we can just go to the COVID-19 stats intent extension and open this NS extension, NS extension attributes, and let's one entry and fill it with select country intent. Okay, let's build and run. Let's add a widget. Let's edit it. Okay, and let's add another one. Okay, looks nice and good. That's it for the part 2 of the tutorial series. To recap, first, we have declared the custom select country intent and add support for the widget in the IntentDefinition file. Then, we create a custom country parameter for the intent. Third, we created the intent extension target to provide handler for retrieving dynamic values for the parameters. Then we implement the IntentTimelineProvider protocol to provide timeline entries and snapshot based on the value of the parameter. And finally, we set up the widget to use the intent configuration with custom intent and timeline provider. I hope with this tutorial, it will help all of you to create more amazing widgets in your app. Until the next one, stay safe and healthy. Bye.